My name is Clara Pemberton. I am 41 years old. And the evening my stepmother had the security chief escort me from my own father's charity gala in front of his trustees, his oldest colleagues, and the photographer from the regional society page. My father watched it happen from across the room and did not move. He saw me. I know he saw me. We made eye contact for exactly the length of time it takes a person to decide what they are and are not willing to do. Then he looked away. I walked out through the side entrance because I still had enough of my mother in me to spare everyone the spectacle. The night was cold, and the car park was quiet, and I stood between two parked cars and breathed the kind of breath you take when you need to remind yourself that you are a grown woman and not the 12-year-old who used to wait in this exact building for her mother to finish the quarterly accounts. By the time I drove home, I had stopped trying to understand a leaner. By the time I reached my mother's old desk, the one I'd moved into my spare room 11 years ago and never once opened, I had stopped being someone who waits to be included in her own family's story. What I found in that desk did not make me angry. It made me very, very still. Because my mother, quiet, methodical, underestimated by everyone who ever sat across a table from her, had not left me sentiment. She had left me leverage. And the people who had spent a decade rewriting her name out of everything she ever touched had been operating, this entire time, on terms she had set before she died. They just never thought anyone would bother to look. Clara walked out through the side entrance that night to spare everyone the scene. She'd been doing that her whole life, choosing the quieter exit, the smaller space, the less inconvenient version of herself. She never opened the desk, until tonight. If you've ever called your patients something more dignified than it actually was, this story is for you. Drop desk in the comments if you're already feeling this one. And make sure you're subscribed and turn on notification, because what Clara finds inside that drawer changes everything. For everyone. The drawer had been locked for 11 years, and the key, which I found taped to the underside of the desk in an envelope with my name on it, had been placed there by a woman who understood, even in her final months, exactly how long her daughter would need before she was ready to use it. The drive took 3 hours and 14 minutes. Gabriel knew because she counted, the way she used to count things as a child when she needed something to do with the fear. She had dressed carefully, not to impress them, to remind herself that she was someone before she walked through that door, and she would still be someone after. The harbor crown rose against the harbor sky exactly the way it always had, 4 stories of pale stone, every window lit, the old dock stretching out dark below it. She sat in the car park for longer than she intended. A couple crossed in front of her headlights, laughing at something private between them. She watched them go in. Her mother had stood in that doorway every morning for 22 years. Gabriel got out of the car. The lobby hit her first. Not the people, not the noise on the wall. The long stretch of pale plaster beside the tall window where the brass plaque had lived since she was old enough to read it. There was a backlit sign there now. Clean edges, modern lettering, a founding year she recognized as wrong. She stood in front of it for a moment, the way you stand in front of something that requires you to decide how much it will cost you. A hand touched her elbow. Light, familiar. You came. Sal, the doorman. He had to be 70 now, but he still stood the same way, like the door mattered, and he knew it. He took her coat exactly the way he used to take her mother's, and his face arranged itself carefully into something that wasn't quite a smile. 4th floor storage, he said quietly without her asking. They put the old things up there. All of them. I know where. She didn't have time to answer. Cross the room, past the champagne tower and the clustered trustees and the journalist from the regional business page with a recorder in his hand, Vivian's gaze found her through 40 feet of conversation and candlelight. The smile didn't shift. The glass came down onto a passing tray. And then Vivian was moving, and 3 other people in dark suits were moving too, and Gabriel understood with the particular clarity of someone who has been naive about something for a very long time that this had been anticipated. Her being here had been anticipated, which meant the invitation had not been a peace offering. She looked for her father. He was already there at her side, earlier than she expected, color in his face, his voice low enough that only she could hear it. The words he chose after 16 years, after everything were "Gabby, please, don't make a scene," not to Vivian. To her, something settled in Gabriel's chest then. Not anger, something quieter and more permanent than anger. The kind of understanding that, once it arrives, cannot be asked to leave. Vivian reached her, and smiled, and said the thing she said. Vivian said it the way you state a fact you've already grown bored of. She's not family. 4 words, aimed just past Gabriel's shoulder, pitched at a volume that wasn't quite private. The men in dark suits adjusted their positions. The journalist with the recorder took a half-step closer without appearing to. Gabriel didn't move. The strange part wasn't the words. It was the room's response. The way conversation dimmed in a careful ring around them. The way eyes found something else to study. The practiced social choreography of people who had learned that witnessing something uncomfortable was impolite. Nobody looked directly at her. Nobody looked away completely. Her father's hand was still at her elbow. She could feel the slight pressure of it, the old familiar weight of his wanting her to make this easier for everyone. He had always wanted that. At her mother's funeral, at Thanksgiving 4 years ago, at every junction where he'd had to choose between what was right and what was quiet, he had never once chosen wrong loudly. Please, he said. Just that. Not her name this time. Just the word, worn smooth from overuse. Gabriel looked at him. Not with anger, she had moved past anger somewhere between the car park and the lobby door. She looked at him the way you look at a place you used to live, when you go back after a long time and realize the rooms were smaller than you remembered. She picked up her coat from Sal's hands. He gave it to her without expression, but his fingers held the lapel 1 second longer than necessary. A small, deliberate thing. The only protest available to a man in his position. She walked to the door without hurrying. Behind her she heard Vivian's voice lift again, warm and carrying, reshaping the room's attention the way a good host does smoothly, without apparent effort. She couldn't hear the specific words. She didn't need to. She had heard that particular tone her whole life. The one that made her the problem, retroactively, without ever saying so directly. The cold outside was immediate. She stood at the edge of the circular drive and let it settle over her. And then, from somewhere out past the dock, the harbor bell rang, 6 o'clock. Low and steady, the same as it had always been. Her mother loved that sound. Had stopped whatever she was doing every single evening just to listen to it. Gabriel had thought that was sentiment. She was beginning to think it had been something else entirely, a woman reminding herself daily of the reason she had built something that would outlast her. She had been paying for a storage unit 3 miles from here for 11 years. Monthly, without ever going inside, she stood in the cold and understood for the first time that she had been paying for something she wasn't yet ready to know. Tonight, she was ready. The drive to the storage unit took 11 minutes. Gabriel knew every turn without thinking about it. That was the part that stayed with her, how automatically her hands moved, how her body navigated toward a place she hadn't entered in over a decade, as though it had been waiting all along for exactly this night. Unit 114 smelled the way abandoned things smell. Dust and cold concrete, and the faint chemical note of old cardboard. She had a padlock key on her keyring that she'd moved from set to set for 11 years without ever once using it. It turned on the first try. Most of it was furniture under drop sheets. A bicycle she'd forgotten she owned. 3 bankers' boxes of tax records from a life she'd largely rebuilt since. She didn't look at any of it. She walked to the back shelf, the one she'd put up herself the weekend she'd moved the unit across cities, and she found what she'd come for. The cedar box was smaller than memory had made it. Honey-colored wood, a small brass latch, her mother's initials burned into the lid with the kind of clean precision that meant someone had taken their time. Her father had pressed it into her hands at the graveside, not at the reception, not at the house afterward, but there, in the cold, with the ground still open. "This is yours," he'd said. "Just yours," as if he already knew it needed protecting from the rest of them. She carried it to the front of the unit and set it on an overturned crate beneath the bare bulb. For a long time, she just looked at it. She had spent 16 years telling herself she wasn't ready. What she understood now, standing in the cold under a single light with her coat still on and the evening still raw in her chest, was that readiness had nothing to do with it. She had been afraid. Not of grief. She knew how grief worked, had learned to carry it like a stone in a coat pocket, always there, never mentioned. She had been afraid of what happened after grief, of what came next when you finally stopped treating loss as a reason to stay still. Her thumb found the latch, the lid lifted without resistance. She had braced for photographs, for the small, tender wreckage of a life that ended too early, and those things were there. She could see the edges of them beneath the top layer. But they were not what her mother had placed first, with deliberate care, where the very first thing a person would see upon opening was not sentiment but intention, a business card, cream stock, navy lettering, a name, a title, and beneath it, in her mother's own handwriting, in blue ink that had barely faded, 3 words, "Call her first." Gabriel read it twice. Then she read the title again, slowly, the way she read documents that required her full attention. Her whole profession went very quiet inside her. Her mother had not left her grief, she had left her a structure, and suddenly 16 years of silence had a different shape entirely. It rang at exactly 6 o'clock. She heard it from the circular drive, low and steady, rolling in off the dark water the way it always had. The same note, the same weight. Her mother had heard that bell every evening for 22 years and stopped whatever she was doing to listen. Gabriel had thought that was a habit. Standing in the cold with the evening still pressing against her chest, she understood for the first time that it wasn't a habit at all. It was a choice, made daily, to remember why the work mattered. She stood there until the sound finished and the silence returned. A car moved past on the harbor road. Somewhere behind the hotel's tall windows, the evening was continuing without her, the glasses refilling, the conversation resuming, the room reshaping itself around her absence the way rooms always do. She had been reshaping herself around their comfort for 16 years, making herself smaller, quieter, easier to accommodate, choosing the side door and the shorter visit and the gentler question, calling it grace, calling it maturity, calling it the kind of dignity that doesn't need an audience. It wasn't any of those things. She knew that now with the particular clarity that only arrives after something is taken from you in public, not because the taking itself was new, but because this time there had been witnesses. This time she had watched her own father choose the easier direction, and she had seen it clearly, without the softening layer of hope she'd carried for most of her adult life. Hope, she thought, was the last thing to cost you. The valet brought her car. She tipped him without counting what she put in his hand, got in, and sat for a moment with both hands on the wheel and the engine running. She had a choice. She could take the coast road home, make tea, sleep badly, and return on Monday to the careful, self-contained life she'd spent 16 years constructing at a safe distance from everything that hurt. She had done it before. She was very good at it. Or she could take the turn toward the industrial estate 3 miles east, where a corrugated steel unit had been sitting under a monthly direct debit for 11 years, holding everything she hadn't been ready to look at. The strange thing about avoidance is that it requires constant maintenance. Every month, she had authorized that payment without examining why. Every month she had told herself there was nothing urgent inside. She had never once asked herself what she was actually protecting, whether it was the contents of the unit or herself from them. She pulled out of the circular drive. She did not take the coast road home. And somewhere in the last 3 miles, as the harbor lights shrank in her mirror and the streets grew quieter, she felt something she hadn't expected. Not dread, not grief, something that felt cautiously like arriving. The box was exactly where she'd left it. Back shelf, right side, set apart from everything else, as though she'd known even then that it needed its own space. She stood in front of it for a moment without touching it. The bare bulb above threw a flat, honest light over everything. The drop-sheeted furniture, the bicycle with its flat tire, the stacked records of a life she'd largely moved past. None of it mattered. There was only the cedar box, honey-colored under the dust, her mother's initials pressed into the lid with the kind of careful permanence that meant someone had wanted it to last. She carried it to the front of the unit and sat down on the concrete floor with it in her lap. The cold came up through her coat immediately. She didn't move. She had expected to open it. That had been the plan for the entire 11-minute drive. She would go in, retrieve the box, lift the lid, find whatever her mother had left inside, and finally close the chapter she'd been living inside of for 16 years. It had seemed straightforward in the car. Most things seem straightforward until you are actually holding them. Her hands stayed flat against the sides of the wood. The crying, when it came, arrived without warning. Not the kind she'd managed at the funeral, measured, appropriate, contained within the understood boundaries of public grief. This was older than that. It came from somewhere beneath the composed professional and the self-sufficient adult, and the woman who had learned to take the side entrance and call it dignity. It came from the 20-year-old in the ill-fitting dress who had stood at a graveside in March and believed her father when he said they would figure it all out together. She cried for that version of herself for a long time. When it passed, she wiped her face on her sleeve and sat quietly in the aftermath of it. The unit was very still. Outside, a car moved through the estate and its headlights swept briefly across the ceiling and were gone. Then her mother's voice came back. The way it always came back, complete, unhurried, as though no time had passed at all. Last winter. The window overlooking the iced dock. The bell is sitting silent in the cold. The water doesn't belong to whoever's loudest. A pause, the thin grip of her hand. It belongs to whoever stays. Gabriel had thought she meant the staff. The loyal ones. The chef who'd been there 20 years, the doorman who still stood like the door mattered. She had filed it under the gentle wisdom of a woman growing tired, and she had moved on because moving on was what she did. She understood now that her mother had never once said anything she didn't mean precisely. Whoever stays. Her thumb found the latch. It was smaller than she remembered. Cold to the touch. She didn't open it. Not yet. But for the first time in 16 years, she didn't move her hand away either. The latch gave with almost no resistance. A small, clean click made the sound of something that had been waiting a long time to be opened, and had not rusted from the waiting. She lifted the lid slowly, the way you open something when you're still deciding whether you're ready for what's inside. The elastic band had gone brittle with age, barely holding its shape around the card on top. She lifted it free carefully. Cream stock, navy lettering, precise and understated in the way that serious professional documents tend to be. A name. A title. A firm she didn't recognize but immediately understood because she spent her working days inside the architecture of exactly these arrangements. Independent trustee. Fiduciary management. Beneath the printed text, in blue ink, in her mother's handwriting, 3 words. Call her first. Gabriel sat very still on the concrete floor with the card between 2 fingers and let her professional mind do what it had been trained to do. Not the daughter part. The lawyer part. The part that had spent 14 years reading the fine print that other people skimmed. An independent corporate trustee meant one specific thing. A trust structured deliberately outside her father's control. Not a will pass through probate, get contested, get reshaped by whoever is left standing at the right moment. A trust with its own fiduciary was a different instrument entirely. Separate, self-contained, administered by a professional whose obligation ran not to the family, but to the terms her mother had set before she died. The strange part wasn't that her mother had done this. The strange part was how long it had taken Gabriel to sit still long enough to find it. She turned the card over. A phone number, handwritten on the back in the same blue ink. No area code, just the number, as if her mother had assumed Gabriel would know where to call from. She told herself it was nearly midnight. She told herself that fiduciaries do not answer at midnight, that whatever this was had waited 16 years and could manage another 8 hours. She told herself she needed to be clear-headed for this kind of conversation, rested, professional, not sitting on a cold floor in a storage unit with her coat still buttoned. All of that was reasonable. She called anyway. It rang twice. Then a woman's voice, unhurried and completely awake, answered as though she had simply been sitting somewhere quiet, expecting exactly this. "This is Marion Webb." Gabriel's throat tightened in a way she hadn't anticipated. She had prepared for an answering service, for a voicemail, for the small practical obstacle of having to wait. She had not prepared for a real voice, calm and present at the other end of a number her mother had written by hand. "My name is Gabriel Townsend," she said. "I think you knew my mother." A pause, brief. "The kind that carries something inside it, Miss Townsend." The woman's voice shifted, not warmer exactly, but more deliberate, as though she were choosing her next words with the care they deserved. "I've been waiting a very long time for this call." Gabriel looked down at the cedar box still open in her lap, at the photographs she hadn't yet reached, at everything her mother had arranged and sealed and trusted her to eventually find. She understood, with sudden and complete certainty, that the conversation she was about to have would not end tonight. Marion Webb's office smelled like paper and good coffee, and the particular quiet of a room where serious things were discussed without drama. It was on the 4th floor of a building that had no branding on its exterior, just a street number and a brass intercom panel that had clearly been there for decades. The kind of firm that didn't need to advertise because its clients came through trust, in both senses of the word. Marion herself was 60, perhaps a little older. Silver-haired, unhurried, with a way of settling into her chair that suggested she had delivered difficult information to people many times before and had learned that patience was a form of respect. She had a single folder on the table between them. Closed, for now. Her mother's name on the tab, neatly typed. "She came to me 2 years before she died," Marion said. She was very clear about what she wanted and very clear about the order in which she wanted things to happen. "Why didn't you contact me?" Gabriel said. It came out evenly without accusation. A professional question because she instructed me not to. Marion folded her hands on the closed folder. "There was a provision. I was to wait for you to come to me, not the other way around." She was specific about that. Why, she believed that if I approached you first, the circumstances wouldn't be right, that the family would find a way to make whatever followed about something other than what it should be about. A pause. She also set a timing condition, an age threshold. Gabriel said nothing. "She already knew you turned 36 in October," Marion said. "The condition is met." The folder opened. Marion didn't hand it across. She turned it slightly so they could both see the first page and began walking through it the way a person does when they have rehearsed this moment and want to get it right. The trust held a single-purpose holding company. The holding company held one asset, a piece of real estate. Gabriel kept her expression steady. She was good at that. She had built a career on being the calmest person in rooms where money was changing hands and old arrangements were being unwound. She read contracts for a living. She knew how structures like this worked. The quiet elegance of separating the building from the business, keeping ownership at arm's length from operation, ensuring that whatever happened on the surface of things, the foundation stayed exactly where you put it. She knew before Marion said it what the asset was. Her stomach knew first. The land, Marion said, the waterfront parcel. She turned one page, and the building on it. She looked up. The Harbor Crown. Gabriel set her coffee cup down. Carefully. She needed something to do with her hands that didn't betray what was moving through her chest. 16 years of assumptions dissolving all at once, reforming into something she didn't yet have the full shape of. Her father had never owned it. Not once. Not for a single day. "There's more," Marion said quietly, "in the folder. But I think you need a moment first." She was right. Gabriel took the moment. Outside the window, the harbor was flat and gray in the morning light, and somewhere out past the dock, the building her mother had built from nothing was still standing exactly where she'd left it. Still standing. Still waiting. Still, in ways Gabriel was only beginning to understand, entirely hers. Marion turned the next page without rushing it. The trust held reserve capital. Liquid, conservatively invested, untouched since the year her mother had established the account. 16 years of quiet accumulation. When Marion said the number, Gabriel set her coffee cup down with more care than the action required, the deliberate steadiness of someone making sure their hands don't give them away. $17 million. She sat with that for a moment. Not with the number itself. She had worked with larger figures, and had closed deals that dwarfed it on paper. What she sat with was the image of her mother, in the last year of her life, making these arrangements. Sitting across from Marian in the same office, or one very like it, with the harbor visible from the window, methodically building a structure designed to outlast her own presence in it. Not from bitterness, from clarity. Her mother had always known exactly what she was doing. Gabriel had simply never asked. "There is one more thing," Marian said. She reached into the folder and produced a sealed envelope. Standard size, ivory white, sealed with the kind of care that suggested it had been handled very few times since it was first placed there. Gabriel's name on the front, not her full name, not her professional name. Just Gabby in blue ink, in a handwriting she would have recognized in any room, in any context, for the rest of her life. The slant of the G, her mother's G, the one that always leaned slightly forward, as though the letters were in a mild hurry to get somewhere. Marian turned her attention to the window. Quietly, without ceremony. Giving Gabriel the only privacy the room could offer, the envelope opened cleanly. One page, folded once. Her mother had never been long-winded and had always believed that the right words, chosen carefully, did more than many words chosen quickly. The letter was true to that. It was not long. It did not explain itself more than it needed to. Gabriel read it once, looking for the meaning beneath the surface the way she read every document methodically, without assumption. Then she read it again, more slowly, because the second time was for herself and not for the lawyer in her. She folded it along the crease her mother had made. The same crease. She didn't want to add another. For a moment she simply sat with the folded letter between her hands and looked at the middle distance, at nothing in particular, the way people look when something has just reorganized their internal landscape and the new arrangement hasn't fully settled yet. Marian turned back from the window. She didn't ask what the letter said. She had clearly known for a long time that it wasn't hers to know. "What happens now?" Gabriel said. Her voice was level. The lawyer's voice. The one that didn't betray what was happening underneath it. "That," Marian said carefully, "depends entirely on what you decide you want." It was the right answer. It was also, Gabriel realized, the first time in 16 years that anyone had asked her that question and meant it. She read the last line 3 times, not because it was difficult to understand, because it was the kind of sentence that asks something of you that requires you to sit with it long enough to feel the full weight of what it means. Her mother had written it without flourish, the same way she had done everything, directly with precision, without wasting a single word on softening what needed to be said plainly. "Don't fight them, sweetheart. Just stop renting them your silence." Gabriel folded the letter once, along the crease her mother had made. She didn't add another fold. It felt important not to. She placed it in her breast pocket, against her chest, and sat for a moment with her hand flat over it. Marian was still looking at the folder, giving her the courtesy of the quiet. Outside, the harbor moved in its slow, indifferent way, the same water, the same light, the same dock extending out beneath the same sky it had always been beneath. Her mother had stood at a window overlooking that water and built something that lasted. Quietly, without announcement, in the language of deeds and trusts, and carefully worded provisions, the language that actually holds things in place when the people involved are gone, and the ones left behind begin deciding what the story was. She had not built it as a weapon. Gabriel understood that now, clearly, in a way she wouldn't have been ready to understand at 25 or 30 or even 35. It wasn't about winning. It was about permanence. About ensuring that the loudest voice in the room could never be the final one, not because it was silenced, but because the foundation beneath it belonged to someone else entirely. The chrome panel in the lobby, the false founding year. The fund was renamed, the plaque stored rather than discarded, even though it had a logic to it now. Vivian had been thorough, but she had worked on the surface of things. She had never thought to look at what the surface was resting on. Nobody had. Gabriel placed both hands flat on the table and looked at Marian directly. "The plaque," she said. "It's in 4th floor storage." "I was told that last night." "I know," Marian said. And the way she said it without surprise, without elaboration, suggested she had known for some time and had understood that this moment would arrive when it arrived and not before. I want it back in the lobby. That can be arranged. And the fund. Gabriel kept her voice even. My mother's fund. I want it restored. Marian opened her pen. Then we begin there. Gabriel reached into her coat pocket and found her phone. She set it on the table between them without turning the screen over to hide what she was doing. 68 missed calls. She had noticed them that morning and let them sit. She turned it face down now. Not because they frightened her, because they could wait. For the first time in 16 years, she was the one deciding when things happened, and she had only just begun. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. And if you know someone who needs to hear this today, share it with them.